For more on this developing story, let's bring in former CIA analyst Fred Fleitz. Fred's also a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Fred, welcome back to America's Forum. Why on earth would the Pentagon go to these lengths to talk about the specific time frame for an operation while it's still in the planning phase?
Good morning, JD. There are some reports this morning that there's no political angle here, and we shouldn't be faulting the Obama administration for this leak. Yes, we should. This administration constantly leaks classified information to advance itself, especially when it's in a political bind. And they're in a political bind right now because they're facing enormous criticism over the president's refusal to name the enemy and to come up with a clear strategy to fight ISIS. It is simply too much of a coincidence that in the midst of all this criticism, this suddenly comes out. It was generally known an attack on Mosul was coming in the spring, hadn't been confirmed. The danger of this leak is that by giving such specific details of this attack, we're giving the ISIS fighters an opportunity to dig in, to set booby traps, to set IEDs. It was incredibly irresponsible.
So my question is, you mentioned it as a leak. As I understand it, there was a formal briefing yesterday at the Pentagon. Did they give the briefing as an excuse saying, well, the information's been leaked anyway? But it was truly described by some who cover the Pentagon as unprecedented to put a time frame on an upcoming military operation.
No, you're right. I shouldn't use the word leak. They disclosed this. They came right out and revealed the plan, which I think is unprecedented. It wasn't a leak. It was done openly. It wasn't whispered into the ear of a reporter. But it's still irresponsible because we're telegraphing to the enemy our plan, which is going to give ISIS an opportunity to dig in and prepare efforts to stop the attacks. There aren't that many ISIS fighters. There's estimated maybe 1,500 to 3,000 in Mosul, 25,000 Iraqi troops are supposed to attack, maybe 3 brigades of Iraqi Kurd troops. And I think they will take the city, but the number of casualties will be higher because ISIS will have an opportunity to defend.
All right, so they've telegraphed the punch from the Pentagon. I would imagine they're not being so forthcoming about ground troops from the United States, but is this in any way, shape, fashion, or form a precursor to the U.S. reintroducing ground forces?
Well, we have ground forces in Iraq right now. They're called military advisors. They're supposedly not combat troops, but you know the president has sent troops back into Iraq. Let's not let him get away with saying that he didn't. They're not in a combat operation right now. I think we're going to need special forces, but American troops are not going to take back Mosul. The president doesn't want to do that. The political support does not exist in Washington to do that. But beyond Mosul, I don't know how much progress will be made without some type of military force. It's going to have to include troops from other countries.
A minute 30 remains in this segment, Fred. The concern has been, despite all the time and energy and money spent on training up the Iraqi military, in recent years, especially when a lot of our forces left, the Iraqi military walked away from the fight, laid down their arms. What would be different this time?
Well, hopefully they're getting sufficient training so they'll be ready to take on ISIS and fight them. We know the ISIS fighters are good. They know they're well armed. We know they're still being supplied. There's efforts to cut off their supply right now, but that hasn't been accomplished yet. But that's going to be a question. ISIS is trying to undermine their morale by these atrocities, by making it clear that if ISIS catches Iraqi Kurdish troops, they're going to be beheaded or burned to death. And that has an effect on the ability of these troops to stand and fight.
Fred Fleitz, we're going to ask you to stay with us, and when we come back, former Green Beret Scott Mann will join us. This extraordinary telegraphing of a military punch. Yes, it is true. Dwight Eisenhower told the war correspondents following him in 1944 the date of D-Day, but none of those foreign correspondents or those war correspondents disclosed the date. How different times have become. More on the threat represented in ISIS when we continue here on America's Forum. Let's continue the conversation now with former CIA analyst Fred Fleitz. We'll also bring in D. Scott Mann, retired lieutenant colonel with the U.S. Army Special Forces. Colonel, we thank you for Skyping in. Fred, we need an intelligence update. What are you hearing? What is the buzz about the situation today in Libya?
Well, it looks like ISIS has built up a presence in Libya that the world did not notice. They sent operatives in early last summer. They took a different tactic in working with other Islamist groups, including Al-Qaeda, and they're taking advantage of the huge amounts of weapons stolen from Libyan weapons depots. And I think they have formed a rather potent force there, which, given the fact that there's anarchy and they're so close to Europe, it's a real security concern.
Fred, at the outset of your comments, we saw a video of a man that American intelligence believes may be American, who took part in that beheading of 21 Christians. Any more updates on the identity of that man in that terrible videotape?
I have not seen that video, JD, but what concerns me is that this group seems to be walking in lockstep with directions from ISIS in Syria and Iraq. This staged execution wasn't something they decided to do for no apparent purpose or on their own. This is part of the program of terrorism by ISIS to recruit followers and to wear down the resolve of the West.
Scott, I want to turn to you now and try to understand, really get a grip on what's going on geopolitically. Maybe it's too early to say this, but looking back at Benghazi, not the explosions today, but that embassy attack a couple of years back that killed 4 Americans, was that for all intents and purposes the birth of ISIS in Libya?
Well, it certainly was. I think it was one cataclysmic event that set conditions for it. As we look back on this thing, we'll find kind of how they made their path in there. But I think one of the things that we need to understand about ISIS, the way these guys operate, is they come from the bottom up. They basically exploit chaos. They come in from the bottom up, they establish themselves locally, and they exploit marginalized clans and tribes. And they can do that below the noise. They can do it below the radar. If you look at how they've established themselves with the marginalized Sunnis in Iraq and Syria, no one was paying attention. Everyone was paying attention to all the noise up top, and they come in from the bottom. So events like Benghazi make it possible.
And just a follow-up to that, Scott, if it worked in Libya, if it's working around the Middle East, do we take seriously the boast and the threat of ISIS that it comes next to Europe, specifically across the Mediterranean to Italy and Rome?
You better believe it. These guys are serious about the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. Part of their legitimacy in the eyes of the religious base, their ummah, is their ability to demonstrate geographic control, and they are absolutely doing this, and they're going to continue to do that. What we have to look for, JD, is that they exploit undergoverned areas in fragile states that are off the pavement, so to speak. They go into these areas that are already marginalized and tribal and based on honor and revenge and feud, and they exploit them, and they establish there and they set up camp. And they're expanding that all over the globe. And yeah, they're definitely making their move here. This is not just contained in Iraq and Syria.
And while ISIS is on the march in Washington, a whole lot of talk at the White House. The Summit on Violent Extremism is wrapping up today. Fred, you wrote a column about this. President Obama had some comments you noted in your latest column. Let's listen to the president, and then, Fred, we'll get your reaction following them.
The reality, which again many Muslim leaders have spoken to, is that there's a strain of thought that doesn't embrace ISIL's tactics, doesn't embrace violence, but does buy into the notion that the Muslim world has suffered historic grievances. Sometimes that's accurate. Does buy into the belief that so many of the ills in the Middle East flow from a history of colonialism or conspiracy.
Fred, what's your reaction to those comments?
If I told you he said these things, JD, I don't think you'd believe me. What kind of legitimate grievances justify beheadings and burning people to death? And what types of people are inspired to join a group because of such grievances? This is absolute nonsense. These people are motivated by unifying ideology, radical Islam, and something called Sharia, a doctrine of a way of life, a medieval way of life that they want to impose on the world through violence. A jobs program is not going to stop these people. We know a lot of the foreign fighters, thousands of them, are buying plane tickets to fly to Turkey to join ISIS. They're not poor. We know very rich people, rich sheiks in the Gulf are funding ISIS. They're not economically deprived. Osama bin Laden was the son of a billionaire. What is the president talking about?
And on that note, Fred Fleitz, we thank you. Scott Mann, stay with us. And if you're watching at home, stay with us too as America's Forum continues.